The purpose of this workshop is to talk casually and frankly and hopefully usefully about music theory stuff. Normally at these festivals I'll teach music theory, and there's so much about music theory that requires a kind of careful delivery of data, of information. And for this time I was thinking it'd be really nice to just have some space to like sit down and really apply the different things that we've talked about in the workshops at this festival, or just in general, whatever you may have learned about theory, and to bounce ideas off each other and kind of address questions or confusions or challenges that may come up, to just really have an open-ended, free space to do that. So that's the idea today. Hopefully you have brought questions or things that you want to talk about, because I didn't. With that, so I did a couple workshops. Maybe some of you were at the workshops I taught yesterday and the day before here at the festival. We talked about scales and modes and chords and the naming of chords, and a teeny tiny bit about chord progressions and that kind of thing. We don't have to confine our talk to that stuff today, but I'd be happy to talk about everything from the most basic stuff to whatever the limits of my understanding are. I'm not like a high-level expert in music theory or anything, but I just have a basic working knowledge, and I'd be happy to share whatever I can with you. And if I can't figure it out, maybe somebody else here on the call has some ideas as well. So with that, who would like to propose a subject or ask a question, or what do you want to do? Looks like there's 9 of you.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm super excited because through the course of this workshop this weekend, I'm really starting to get comfortable with thinking about intervals instead of like really thinking about note names. And so I'm wondering, now I want to practice that more. And like for a major scale, I'm really comfortable with the intervals. But where do I are there any resources to like practice resources for maybe arpeggios and minor scales that I can get my head around practicing the interval instead of like the written note? Does that?
Yeah. Well, let me drill into your question a little bit to understand it better. It sounds like what you're saying is that you're getting more comfortable thinking of the notes in their relative sense, like the kind of functional position of the notes in the scale. Is that fair?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, and you're saying that you're familiar with them in the major scale, and by that I'm interpreting that to mean that your ear is pretty good, at understanding where you are in the major scale as you're moving around in it.
Yeah, like through the course of this weekend, I've been able to like start at a different starting point that I never even thought about starting at. Like, so I'm in a completely different key. I might not be tracking the note names, but I'm tracking the whole half. And so I want to practice that more and get that into my brain, and also explore different patterns besides the major scale.
Great.
So the advice on that.
This sounds like a great path that you're on, by the way. This is exactly the kind of getting a looser, or what's the word, a more organic kind of feel for the music that you're doing. What instrument would you call your primary instrument?
I only play fiddle.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. Do you know your way around to like a piano at all?
Just like a C scale. I mean, I know the middle. Yes, I have, and I have a piano in my house.
Oh, great. So what I would recommend, like if I play, I don't mean to put you on the spot here. This isn't an exam. I'm just sort of curious. If I'm playing an octave, right? And if I play an interval, are you at the point where you can tell what the interval is or take a reasonable guess at it? Like if I play this?
No.
Okay.
No. That would be, yes, if you have advice on, I'd love to be able to do that.
Well, I would say step 1 is go to your piano. The fiddle is great, but the lack of frets is going to make this, it might be good to do, assuming your piano is reasonably well tuned. I would use that for this test. And there are tons of resources online. I'm afraid I can't recommend any by name, but there are a million, ear training and all kinds of other scale training kinds of stuff online that you can easily find. But I would say, yeah, if your art, so when you say that your ear's getting familiar with the major scale, you're starting to hear like, oh, so these are whole steps, and maybe you're being able to tell like that's a half step. You're being able to kind of pick that stuff out or hear these little, you're starting to recognize that as part of the major scale, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and being more comfortable with not going, okay, I know the notes in a D scale and a C scale and a G scale, to be able to go, okay, what if, I mean, just the last workshop I did, what if I start on a B? Well, yeah. Now I know how to get.
You can pick it out.
To sound, yeah.
Great.
Exactly.
Yeah, so what I would do is get to the piano, figure out, practice figuring out major scales off of various notes. And again, this isn't, I know we're trying to break away from the major scale, but just for the sake of orientation, start on a key and understand, if you don't already, understand that the piano is just those 12 tones in a line. It's just some of them are black keys and some of them are white. The piano, just like the naming system, has a bias towards the C major scale. So it's really, you just have to play the white keys to play the C major scale. The black keys are all the in-between notes, but they're exactly on equal footing in terms of their the respect they deserve as notes. They're all the same notes. They're just kind of, it's a screwy keyboard, right? So I would go to the piano and just practice going step, step, half step, 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 half step, and kind of just playing major scales. You don't have to become a piano player, but just to kind of get a visual idea of what's going on the keyboard. And then I would find a major scale that you're comfortable in. C scale is fine, white keys, no problem. Just orient yourself into a major scale. And then I would start listening to intervals. This is a really useful kind of first step in your ear training, is being able to hear an interval, like the octave. The octave is very distinct. I mean, it's such a lock, it's kind of hard to miss, right? And if I go up a half step, if I extend the interval of the octave by a half step, that's clearly not an octave, right? It's the octave is so clean. It's the most consonant interval. If I shrink it by a half step, I also get a very distinct interval. And some of the other intervals are pretty distinct as well. This, in other words, this might sound like kind of a challenging thing to get good at if you haven't done it before, but I think it'll come pretty quickly, especially if you've been playing music for a while. Some of these sounds are pretty familiar. Now, the classic way to learn intervals is to learn them as components of melody. The example would be that the octave is somewhere over the rainbow. Whoop, sorry. These first two notes are an octave somewhere. And the fifth, for example, they usually teach us the Viking O-we-o. It's got that sound to it, right? The sixth interval, in other words, from the one note to the sixth note in the major scale, is My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean. That's not exactly the melody, but you get the point. Those first two notes, My Bonnie Lies Over. So each of the intervals have something like that. There's a little mnemonic. The fourth is Here Comes the Bride. And so on. So you can find those lists online. That might be helpful. But once you've got your piano, you can I'd recommend also trying to learn them at the same time just by sound. Like, what do they sound like? This is a sixth, and to me, in my cosmology, it has like a real warm, wide kind of feel to it. I hear it as a little wider than the fifth, which has that kind of drony, this is like a double stop on open strings on the fiddle, It's that fifth sound. In fact, that's it's a great one for you as a fiddle player. That's what a fifth sounds like. This is also the drone on a sitar in the background of Indian music. This is also the drone in Irish music. This is also, that's a lot of things, but that's the sound of the fifth, and that's probably easier to remember than O-we-o or whatever. The third, which is in the middle of the chords that we talked about in the previous workshops. Third has a very particular kind of warm sound. Then the minor third has also a distinct sound, So just like you are starting to get the kind of loosened, I keep saying loosened, that's not what I mean. You're getting the kind of ear for the major scale and different keys and so on. You can do the same thing with intervals, and the more intuitive you get with them, that's like a superpower in music. You can start to hear things. So you'd asked also about, well, before I say it, does that all make sense, and is that useful? Is that going to help you with the intervals?
Yeah, I think it's really a way to practically apply some and reinforce some of the stuff I've learned. So yes, thank you very much.
It's a pretty fun thing to test yourself on too. You know, you can just play 2 keys on the piano at random and just listen and be like, I think that's a whatever, and then you count the half steps and you can check yourself, you know. Oh, Tony, you got your hand up there?
Yeah, I was going to add a suggestion too. If you have someone to play along with, a fun exercise to do is challenge each other. Pick a key that you're going to work in, both play the tonic, and then one person plays a note that's not the tonic, and the other person has to guess and try to play it. And you can go back and forth. So if you got someone to play along with. Something I do for solo practice is I will play a major key, whatever key I want to, and I will sing the degrees, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's not on pitch, but you get the idea. And then after I get comfortable playing the major scale up and down, back and forth in linear fashion, I'll try hopping around, like 1, 3, 5, 3, 1, and see if I can anticipate what the note's going to sound like. I'll try to sing it before I play it and let my instrument correct me.
Yeah, those are great. It's funny that you mentioned singing too. I can't remember if I brought this up in either of those workshops, but I meant to. That the way that we subconsciously know a lot of these scales, even without knowing them consciously. You know, you can. This is a little different from what you're saying, but if you're trying to figure out a scale, whether you're singing it or just playing it on your fiddle or whatever, a lot of times you can just kind of guess at the note, and your ear will tell you, no, that's not the note, and then you can guess again, and you can kind of pick it out that way. But you're probably already doing that. So the other thing you asked about was minor scales or other scales besides the major scale. Should I assume that you have major scale fatigue? Is that what I'm drawing from that?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I'm so comfortable with the major scales, but I've memorized them as like key signatures and like the names of notes, and I think I'm starting to feel freer, like this new exploration, I would say. And so I would like to get that same kind of thing going for some of the scales I'm less, that aren't drilled into my brain.
Are you comfortable with modes? Have you been playing modally much?
Well, yes, I and I'm comfortable with like the explanation of modes, and I memorize tunes, right? So I am playing in modes, but since I don't play a accompaniment instrument, I wouldn't know what to do if I had to like improvise in a mode, I suppose. Do you know? I don't know if that makes sense.
I think so. Yeah, it's kind of one thing to understand conceptually what they are, and it's another to be fluid in it. And
exactly.
Yeah. Not to be glib, but like one sort of easy answer to this is just practice, of course. And but you know that already. But the first thing I think of when someone is bored with not that you're bored, but someone's bored with major scales is to get into modes. And modes, because of the way that we think of modes as this sort of shifted labeling of the major scale, right? Where instead of playing from the 1 to the 1, we're thinking of like the 6 or the 2 or something else is now the tonic. And so now it's like there's enough labels already, but now you've got a secondary layer of labeling that you're trying to like work out in your head as you play, and that can be a little off-putting sometimes. But what I do, like when I play these whistles, which are the major scale, I love to play in modes, and the first thing I'll do is I'll say, all right, I'm going to play the third mode. It's one of my favorites to play in on the whistle. It's to Western ears, it's a very exotic sounding mode, the Phrygian mode. They call it. I'll go as far as just working out where the 1 is and where the 5 is. That's kind of like the skeleton that I work out. So in the major scale, the 1 is the 1 and the 5 is the 5, and it's all, in fact, maybe I should just pull up a little, well, I don't know if this is going to confuse things or help things, but let's see if this is useful. here's our major scale from the 1 to the 1. Now, the 5 is the 5, right? Now, if I'm playing the third, too many wires. If I'm playing the third mode of the major scale, that means I'm going to start from the 3 and go to the 3. Still going to use the same notes as the major scale. Right? So in my alternate universe that I'm creating here, these are now the tonics, the 3s. So these are actually the 1s. And what I'm saying is that instead of saying, okay, well, that means this is the flat 2, I don't know if that's legible on the screen. And this is the, I should draw this differently. That's the flat 2, this is the flat 3, this is the 4, this is the 5, this is the flat 6. And instead of like working all that out and necessarily worrying about that, just to get my bearings, what I'll do is just figure out which note is the 5th, right? So I know that that is the 5th in this mode. And then, you know, I'm just going to rely on my muscle memory and my, I'm going to rely on my muscle memory and, you know, how I've practiced that major scale to just have fun noodling, you know. And as I get more familiar with the scale, I'll be like, okay, I know that if that's the 5, then this is the flat 6. It's right above it. You know, you can kind of get more intimate with practice and time. But just the 1 and a 5 is enough of sort of a framework that I can improvise in it and have fun with it and not have to sweat too much all the math. So I can on the whistle, for example, this will be a different key, but here's the major scale. Now I'm going to go up to the third mode, starting here. And then I figure out, where's the 5th? Oh, we oh, the Viking chant right there. And now I'll just noodle around. If I want to take it one step further, I might figure out what the chord note is, like the flat 3rd in this case, you know, which is just 2 steps up the scale from there. And then I can do an arpeggio, like you were suggesting, over that chord. So if this is the 1, this is the 2, in this case the flat 2, and then the flat 3. Now I'm doing an arpeggio up and down the root tonic position chord there. So that's the way I'm playing now in that mode, and I can sound like I mean it. You know, I know that I have my basic bearings of where the home is. I know what the 1 is now. It's what used to be the 3. But I also know a little more than that. I know where the 5 is, and I know where the 3 is. And I can kind of accent those, and I can really sound like I'm intending to play in this key instead of just playing the major scale. Shifted a few notes, right? And of course, if someone's playing a chord underneath it, that helps the illusion as well, and so forth. So that would be the first thing I would do, is get into modes. There's lots of fun modes. They sound really cool. And then the next thing would just be like, what are some other kind of fun scales? Do you feel comfortable, like, if you just like look up a scale or make up a scale or something and you have the shape, do you feel like you're able to work that out on the fiddle and become familiar with it?
Yeah, that's I think the breakthrough that I've had is the finger shapes. I've memorized, you know, I've memorized from playing from sheet music the key signature and then the scale that goes with that key signature, not really paying too much attention to the finger shapes, but getting my head around that, I don't actually need to know the names of the notes, or as long as I know the name of the tonic, right? Like, that's kind of a cool thing. Yeah,
the shape, and you know, and as long as you've got the multiple string thing, so there's a little bit of juggling with that as you're moving around. But yeah, if you suddenly realize, oh, the 7 is always a half step under the 1 in the major scale, then that is going to be applicable to every key wherever you are, and so on. So that's great. It sounds like you've done a lot of the hard work, and this is more of the like, oh, there are these patterns, and now I can apply them stage.
Yeah, it's cool.
I would check out, if you're interested in some minor scales, I'll just throw a couple at you. And these are besides the modal minors. The modal minors are awesome, and maybe even my favorite, but like the Phrygian I just played is one of my favorites. But one of them that I like a lot is I always forget if it's the harmonic minor or the melodic minor, but I use this all the time. This is used a lot in minor keys. So I have to take off the scale here. Ouch. Most minor scales have the same thing going on between the 1 and the 5. I'll say most, but there's some Western bias in that. You've got the tonic, you've got the 2, you've got a flat 3, you've got a 4 and a 5. And then what happens in this department is kind of where they're different. So the melodic minor that we saw uses a flat 6 and a flat 7. But the what I'm calling right now from memory the harmonic minor, but it might be the melodic minor, it doesn't really matter. Instead of a flat 7, it has a natural 7. And so the unusual thing about this scale is there's a really big gap. Well, big by our standards. There's a jump right here, right? Of a step and a half, which is not otherwise happening in this scale. So you might recognize this sound. It's kind of a cliche used in movies a lot to indicate exotic Eastern music. But it's a really beautiful scale, and it's a really beautiful scale to use in melodies, minor melodies. I use it all the time in half of the tunes I write. Let's see, what's another interesting, this is also a really unusual scale for our Western ears, but this is not a minor scale, but you might enjoy it because it's pretty different. You've got a 1, a flat 2, a 3 and a 4, a 5 and a flat 6, a 7 and a 1. It's these weird half steps with big gaps in between. Really nice. Used in Indian music and all kinds of stuff. But the cool thing about scales is you can really kind of roll your own. You know, the minor scale, all you have to remember is you got the 1 and the 5 and put a flat 3rd, and then just do whatever you want with the other notes. Do you have a 2 or a flat 2? You could do both. Usually you're not going to have a major 3rd because you've already got your minor 3rd in it. And you've got a 4 and a 5, or you could do a sharp 4. So I know that's all a little vague, but I don't know. Hopefully those are some starting points. The practice of learning the minor scales, just a matter of getting familiar with them, get basic bearings as to where the tonics and the fifths and the minor 3rds are, and then just work them. And I think, with time, how the intervals work out and stuff will be clear. The other question then is, like we talked about in part 2 of the music stuff, is what harmonization comes from that scale as a result. And when you get into these more quote-unquote exotic scales, the harmonizations can be really exotic. The chords that are generated are not normal chords, to fit all those strange note positions. So yeah, Kim.
I'd be interested in hearing more about progressions. There's the 1, there's the 4, there's the 5, but there's more than that, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'll talk about that. Let me take the keys off the screen. So the first thing to remember about progressions is that they are they're happening in combination with a melody, right? So there's like an interplay between those two that you want to be sensitive to. If we start in the kind of simplest case where we've got a major scale, and were you at the workshops, either of the workshops this weekend?
I was at part of a workshop. How about that?
Okay. That's fair. Well, are you familiar with the fact that the major scale kind of begets a set of chords that go with it?
Yeah.
Okay. So that harmonization that we're used to seeing is the 1, the 2 minor, 3 minor, 4, 5, 6 minor, and then the often neglected 7 diminished that we don't really pay attention to. Does that language make sense to you? Okay. So, you know, like maybe you heard me say before, you can kind of just pick them at random. But there are a lot of movements that are very common. Probably the most famous movement is moving from the 5 back to the 1. We talked about this a little bit in the workshop, but this is the classic end of every. This is the end of every classical music piece. It sometimes seems where you do. You know, that 1 5 1 5 1 5 1 5 1 is a very used a lot. You hear it in minor music as well. 5 to the 1 minor happens a lot. The way that these chords sound when you move from one place to another is really dependent on what all the individual notes in that chord are doing as you change to the next chord. So if I pull up real quick the keyboard here and we look at the 1 chord, okay? Let's talk about, let's see, what's the example I want to give here? 1 4 1 5. Yeah, okay, so here's the 1 chord. We see that the 1 chord is using the 1 note, the 3 note, and the 5 note, right? Now let's look at the 6 minor chord. This is using the 3 note, I'm just going to indicate it up top here, the 3 note, the 5 note, and the 7 note, right? These notes, oh boy, it's hard to draw on this thing. These notes are all in common, right? The 3 minor chord, did I say 6? This is the 3 minor chord. The 3 minor chord has 2 notes in common with the 1 major chord, right? And especially if we change the voicing of this chord, so instead of playing this 7 up top, I'm going to play this 7 down here, right? So this is just another version of the 3 minor chord. Let me update my drawing here. What did I just do? Hang on. Stand by 1 second. I don't know what I did. Hold on. Oh my gosh. Technical difficulties. Okay, I'm back. Here's our 1 chord, was the 1 3 5, and we did a different voicing of the 3 minor, which looked like this. So you can see that when these chords change, all that happens is that note moves down to there. We've just gone from the 1 chord to the 3 minor chord. And all we had to do was shift this note, right? This kind of relationship that these chords have with each other, you know, it's something you can just learn by. You can just kind of learn it intuitively and just decide what you think about one, you know, from the 1 to the 3 minor, what that sounds like to you or what you feel about it. Or you can work it out and figure out what all the notes are and how they relate to each other. And it's something, you know, if you're going to get into like arranging vocal harmony arrangements or something like that, then understanding how these chords relate to each other, where the notes move, is a big part of it, because your arrangements can be a lot more sensitive in that fashion. Compare this, for example, to the movement between the 4 and the 5 chord. Here's the 4 chord. We've got the 4, the 6, and the 1. And when I go to the 5 chord, all of those notes have had to move somewhere, right? Now that doesn't mean that's a bad chord progression. The 4 to the 5 happens all the time, but it's a different kind of sound. This is also why you see color notes added sometimes to chords. They can help smooth out the transitions in a chord progression. A common sound you might hear a lot in a chord progression, for example, is when, say I'm going from the 1 chord to the 4 chord. Let's do it in a different key. Here I'm on the 1. I don't know what hopefully this isn't deafening you with the guitar. Right, I went C to C7. Then I went to what's the 4 chord in this key? F. It's a very common thing done in folk music. So why does that work? Well, let's talk about the 1 chord. Now we're going to change key back to F, sorry. So here's our 1 chord, and it uses the 1, the 3, and the 5, and we played that for a few beats, and then we played the 1, 7. So that means we added this note. It's a strange nomenclature, but in the world of naming chords, the 7 chord, which looks like this doesn't mean to add an interval of the sevenths, it means to add a minor seventh. It's just a naming quirk. It doesn't really make sense, but don't worry about it. Well, this note is not actually in the major scale, right? If I show the major scale there, the major scale note's the natural 7. We've added this note. And why does that sound good as we're moving to the 4 chord? Well, let's look at what the 4 chord looks like. It looks like this. It's comprised of the 4, the 6, and the 1. And I'm playing a 1 down here as well. Well, now you can see that on the way to the 4 chord, this note that was in our 1-7 has only had to move down a half step to fit into the 4 chord. So I'll play the 1 chord again, and you can kind of hear this movement as the chords change. This note to here. So these kinds of tricks are going on all the time when you're using chords in a chord progression. You can, again, you can learn what's happening with the numbers and the shifting and the notes, or you can just decide that you like the sound of it. It's useful to have the naming system behind it so that you can, when you hear that sound, you might say, well, what was that? If you look at the song, you figure out what key it's in, you figure out what chords in play, then you can say, all right, that was the 1, and then they went to a 1-7, and then they went to the 4 chord, and it sounds like that. And you can put that in your pocket, and the next time you want that sound, you can pull it out, so on. So a lot of folk tunes will be in that sort of 1-4-5 domain. There's a cool, wonder if I can, that's probably not worth. I'm gonna pull this out. Give me 10 seconds here to see if I can dig up this chord progression here from my notes. Stand by 1 second here. Well, I'm not going to find it. What I came up with was a 12-bar chord progression that covers all of the movements between 1 and 4 and 5, but you can do this kind of thing on your own. A neat exercise, I'm not exactly sure what your usage of chord progressions would be, but if you wanted to be more familiar with them or get to know them a little better, this is kind of a nice exercise to do. You come up with some sort of progression that's moving around between 1s and 4s and 5s and, maybe 6 minor, whatever strikes your fancy. And you just pick a note, like the 1 chord's got the 1, the 3, and the 5 in it, and you just pick one and you start on that note. And then as you move to the 4 chord, try to stay on that note, and if that note doesn't fit in the 4 chord, figure out where it fits. You might have to move up a little bit, might have to move down a little bit. And then when you go to the 1 chord, you might have to move back or stay where you are. And your goal is to stay where you are, but if you have to move, you move. So you might say so I'm gonna sing that note, and I play the 1 chord. Now we've gone here, so I go up to this note. Now I go back down, and now I play the 5 chord. I went down, and then the 1 chord, I decided to go down again, and we go to the 6 minor, and I can stay there. It turns out I didn't have to move. And then if I do the 4 chord after that, I can stay there still, And that's kind of a neat way to start to, I think of it as like a slalom course, like the chords are shifting underneath you and you have to kind of move around to stay on a note. And it helps you kind of get a feel for what the chords sound like. I really think the best way, if you want to start, you can look up common chord progressions. Like an old time 1-4, 1-5 is really common. 1-4-5-1 is really common. There's the classic 1-5-6 minor 4 pattern, which is too many cables. Which is oh no, I did it wrong. these are all, classic pop cycles, 4-measure cycles. But really the best way is to just like sit down with a songbook, of your favorite artists and work it out. Unfortunately, they don't write these symbols in most music. They just write G, C, D, and E minor and that kind of thing. So you're kind of on your own to figure out what these progressions are. It would be really helpful, I think, if they did this, at least had it on the side somewhere. Because what you start to pick up when you do this, besides these kind of common progressions, is little tricks. For example, here's a classic maneuver heard in a million Beatles songs. You do this thing where you go to the 4 chord and then you go to the 4 minor chord and then you go to the 1. And it sounds like this. Right? We've all heard this like 1, 4, minor, 5. Right? It's a really familiar sound. You maybe didn't have a name for it, but that's all it is. It's just going to the 4 and the 4 minor. They do it in all kinds of music. And once you learn the name of it, there's another trick in your another arrow in your quiver. There's another classic one, 1, and then you walk up to a 3, 7, and then the 6 minor. They do this in Georgia. This is the 1 to the 3, 7 to the 6 minor, right? Kind of happens in ragtime a lot. And there's just a million of these. I could throw 30 more of them at you, but it's kind of like really what you'd need to do is break down the songs that and it's kind of a learning hill to get over, to be able to like sit down with a piece of music, figure out what the key is, figure out what the scale is, figure out what the chords that are being used are, and understand what numbers they are. There's a bit of a learning curve at first, but get to that place as soon as you can so you can start finding out what's happening in the music that you're playing, and then you can, oh, this is a cool movement, oh, that's a cool movement, okay, I see what they're doing here, and you just develop a vocabulary like you're learning a language, So that was kind of scattershot. Does that help at all?
Yeah, that's really good. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to learn the sort of progressions there are, because I find the notes in the songs are actually just the broken down progressions. So if I can learn the chords, then I've pretty much got the song already.
Yeah, that's true. In most cases, I do a lot of I play in like a sort of a traditional jazz band, and I'm not the greatest like jazz soloist, when there's lots of really weird chord progressions happening, and so I do this classic thing that beginning jazz soloists do, where I just sort of, I know what the chords are, and I'll just kind of quickly arpeggiate up and down the chords as they're changing. It's kind of a shortcut. And it sounds good, but like jazz players will kind of roll their eyes at you, if you're just like, if you're going like, just kind of doing that all day, they're not being very impressed. But yeah, it's true. Like melodies really pay attention to the chords, and then there's this other situation where they don't, where sometimes the melody, defies the chord, and that can be really beautiful as well. But great. Anyone else have a question? What's the next subject we should talk about? I see some movement. Oh,
I have one.
Hi, Betty.
Hi, everybody. Hey, thanks a lot, Casey. This is great. This is the third time I'm joining you this weekend, so
great.
I have a lot to learn. So I play backup guitar, mostly old time, sometimes a little Quebecois. I have a harder time with that. And I know the basic 1, 4, 5 and the main keys. But sometimes people will say, "Oh, that's in the key of E minor." And if I look at it, say in the Portland books, it looks to me like it's just in the key of G, because the key signature is the key of G. It's just showing 1 sharp. That's what I remember. Am I remembering that wrong? And if I'm remembering that correctly, why is that? Why isn't how does something in the key of E minor look like the key of G?
How well did you understand the modes discussion?
Well, not all that well. So
Okay. So the quick answer, which may not be that useful if you had some trouble with the modes, is that, let me pull up the old scale here. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of different kinds of minor scales, just like there are a lot of different kinds of major scales. We have the major scale, which is the one we use all the time. Similarly, in the world of minor scales, there is a minor scale that's most commonly used in Western folky music. And that's, if you say something's an E minor and you're talking about folk music, it's a good guess that that's the scale we're talking about. And that's the natural minor scale that we looked at a couple times this weekend.
okay.
So I don't know if you remember, but when we talked about modes, we were playing the major scale. There it is, 1 to 1, good old major scale with a particular shape. And we said that the natural minor scale is actually just a mode of the major scale. In other words, if we play this major scale from the 6 to the 6, oops, that shape right there is the natural minor scale. So if, let's say we're in the key of G, just like you were talking about here, pull that up and show those. So if we're in the key of G, you can see that the tonic now, oh, it's not flashing. Oh, hang on, I might have a little, stand by. Where's the key of G? Oh, we'll just do it in G. All right, I got it. So there's our major scale, right? And I decided that we're going to play from the 6 to the 6. So here's 1, 7, 6. Now I'm going to play from the 6. Right? So this is the natural minor scale in E, because we're thinking of this as our tonic now. So we used the G major scale, and if we use this is why the key signature is the same in the sheet music, because it's the same notes. They're just played from a different spot. And they have a special, this is the 6th mode of the G major scale is the E natural minor scale. Now, there's a special term. The 6th mode of scales of the major scale is used so often, they actually have a special name for it. You say that E minor is the relative minor of G. And you say that G is the relative major of E minor. Now again, there's lots of different minor scales, but the one that's just sort of understood is to be this natural minor scale. So in some sense, G and E minor are the same. They're the same key if you're talking about folk music. And the same relationship holds between a whole lot of different keys. You've got C, and the relative minor of C is A minor. D's relative minor is B minor. And you might recognize these as the 1 and 6 minor in these keys, by the way. No coincidence. E is C sharp minor. F is D minor. Maybe, especially if you're a backup guitar player, these relationships probably feel kind of intuitive, right? C and A minor, those are close cousins, right? And then as you commented, G and E minor, and then A goes to F sharp minor. So yeah, if you're talking about the natural minor scale, if that's the kind of minor scale you're working with, then they're basically the same key. Now there is a kind of weird, let me draw out one other point here. When we created our major scale, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. We generated chords that were based off of each of these notes, and we gave them labels accordingly, right? The chords we got from the major scale were these, 4, 5, 6 minor. I'm drawing lazy Roman numerals, but you get the idea. Those are the chords that we got off of the major scale. And if we're in the key of G, that's G, A minor, B minor, C, D, E minor, F sharp diminished. And we just said that the way we get to E minor, the way we think of E minor is that we think of it as the sixth mode of the G major scale here. So we get, but since they are the same notes, if we go through the same process of generating chords, what we're going to find are the same chords. We're going to get this is going to be diminished, this will be, oops, except I'm giving them the wrong numbers now. This, when we made a chord based off of the 6, I'm just going to draw it again down here. It's the same as this up here. I'm hoping this is helpful. I'm skipping the 7 just for space here, but we had the 6 minor. It was an E minor chord when we're in the key of G. If we reframe all the terminology, and this is just a naming switch, this is not even a musical concept really. If we think of this as the 1, and this is the 2, and this is the flat 3, this is how the modes work. You know, when we relabel all of this according to the natural minor scale. When we generate the chords, we're going to get the same chords. So this 6 minor is now labeled the 1 minor. We're going to skip the 7. This 1 is labeled the flat 3 minor. Sorry, major. Flat 3 and so on. These chords will all have different names, but they are all the same chords. It's just a relabeling because of the way the modes work out. Does that make sense? Am I okay, good.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
really helpful.
The thing I wanted to mention that happens in the minor keys sometimes is that if you obey those harmonization chords precisely, then let's say you're writing a tune in the E minor natural, it's a natural minor scale. If you really obey the harmonization of that scale, then the chords you're going to get are E minor, the chords you're going to get for a 1, 4, 5, I should say, are going to be a 1 minor, a 4 minor, and a 5 minor. All of them are minor in the natural minor harmonization. Now this is a very common set of chords to use, but we hear it in contemporary music. We hear this mostly in like reggae, for example. Wrong key, hang on. This is the India Ari song, uses this progression. Okay, but what you will see a lot in minor keys is that they take this 5 chord and they make it major, and often they'll add a 7. So you'll see a B7 here a lot. Even if the melody is kind of largely doing the natural minor, a lot of times they'll just sort of mutate this chord into that. That happens a lot in minor keys. I just want to mention it in case anyone is starting this exploration of like figuring out how the songs they're playing work. So you'll hear this a lot. This is the B7, right? That particular song doesn't do it, but that sound of a this is the 1 minor, 4 minor to the 5, 7. Right? That's a very common minor melody kind of chord progression, to use a 7 chord, a major chord that has a 7 added. I just want to mention that as a sort of a gotcha to watch out for when you're trying to understand what's happening. So even if you've got the G key signature and you're playing a song that's basically in G and there's an E minor chord, you might see a B7 and it might not make sense if you start working things out. A lot of times the melody has to bend to make that work too. It's sort of a thing that happens a lot. This is why in like music theory talk, a lot of times we stay in major land. Wow, my screen's getting really dark. We stay in major land a lot because the theory kind of gets a little squirrely when you start talking about minor keys. They pull more tricks and are a little more playful with things, and I don't know, that's sort of been my experience, is that it's just like a little safer to stay in major land at first, but it's something that I maybe didn't make enough of a point in the other workshops to say, which is that when you go to apply this stuff and things don't line up, when you're like, well, I heard at the workshop or I read online that the 5 note should be this, and then you go to work out the chord and that's not where the 5 note is, you might be wrong. You might have made a mistake, but it's just as likely that the musician was just like, nah, I'm just going to make this a major chord. I'm just going to add this note here. I'm just going to do this differently. You know, that these rules are bent all the time. And it can be really frustrating when you're first getting into stuff and you're trying to like make it all line up. It doesn't always line up. It's bent a lot. In fact, the more of these rules people know, the more they tend to bend them, you know? So don't get discouraged. If a song doesn't make sense and you can't understand why this chord was used or whatever, just put it aside and work on a different one or ask somebody what's going on, you know?
Gee, thank you.
Yeah. What's next?
Well, I have one more quick one. Do you have any references to point us to? I know you said you're on YouTube. Do you have, are there good books or something to look at for music theory or online stuff or?
Yeah, this is going to sound arrogant. I'm sorry. But people have asked me this a number of times over the years, and I have looked in vain to find things I can recommend. That's actually why I made the videos online, because I was fed up with not having something I could point people to. There are lots of like really heavy books on music theory that are incredibly dense or poorly written or, you know, just not something I would recommend for someone starting out. So I'm afraid I can't. I mean, and the other thing is the videos I made online, I made a series called Music Theory Distilled. And it covers basically everything we talked about in this workshop this weekend, but it moves really fast. The whole point of those videos was to condense it down as short as possible. So it's kind of like a blitzkrieg of music theory information in a short amount of time. You can always just pause it, of course, and think about it and rewind it and everything. But I'd point you at that because that's the best I could do in terms of, you know, simply and clearly putting the information out there. I have a number of other videos, like I mentioned, about how to write a melody and find chords for a melody and that kind of stuff. I still haven't found, if you guys find something, let me know. I'd love to have something like a book or something to point people at. There's a guy named, well, I can't really recommend this. There's a guy named Mark Levine who made a book called a Music Theory Handbook or something like that. And then there's a piano version as well. They're very similar, but one's sort of piano centered and the other is a little more generic. But they're really about jazz. And unless you're interested in jazz, they're not really going to be that useful. And they're also kind of impenetrable, like most resources on this. I think the best thing would really there are a lot of good resources online for like interval training and ear training. And, you know, there are programs you can get to like practice improvising to chord progressions if that's something you want to do. I think those would be a lot more useful than any sort of like informational resource. Because just, honestly, like with what we've learned this weekend, that's kind of all you need to know unless you're going to be a jazz musician. It's really like that's the skeleton terminology. And then it's just up to you as to like how quick on your feet you want to be with like, all right, it's an F minor 6. What's the 6? You know, like how quickly you need to be able to do that in your head is sort of dependent on you and your own music. So if I were you, I'd spend my time like learning that major scale shape, learning how the terminology works, looking at songs I know, working them out, figuring out what the chords are, exposing myself to different chord progressions, and then just training my ear as much as possible on like listening to intervals and identify like, is this a major key or a minor key? That's an introductory thing that most people can do already just once they learn the name. You know, is this a major chord or a minor chord? Those kinds of things that you just start there and you just kind of keep building it.
Did you say you had something about writing a melody, how to write a melody or something on YouTube?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think if you just YouTube Casey Connor, how to write a melody, you should find it. It's let me see if I can find the link and I'll put it in the chat here. Yeah, here we go. Okay, I'm entering the link in the chat right now. Yeah, it gives you like some tips and tricks of like, a lot of music theory teachers, and I'm certainly guilty of this sometimes. We'll say like, here's the scale, it's these notes, it's this shape, and now just make music with it, you know, and you're kind of like, all right, you're sort of set adrift in the void, you know, like what do I do now? And that video was an attempt to come up with some like, you know, practical, like, try this, jump around a lot, don't jump around a lot, hit one note in a rhythmic pattern, try arpeggios, try that, you know, like here's a bunch of things you can try to like generate melodic ideas. So maybe it'll be useful for you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions out there? Or we could talk more about anything we've already talked about.
Well, if we're looking for something to talk about, what about augmented and diminished?
Sure.
Chords?
Sure. Now we're back to my my bread and butter. I can use my visual aids again. Okay, so chord naming is a hairy world, but the good thing about it is once you have the name of a chord, you know the shape of it. And that chord is the same wherever you root it. So if you know what the shape of, for example, an augmented chord is, it doesn't matter if it's a G augmented or an A augmented or a B augmented or a C sharp augmented or whatever. It's the notes are all in the same relationship to each other. Of course, you know that it's going to depend on your instrument exactly how easy it is to play in these different keys. You know, like piano has biases to certain keys and guitar has biases to certain keys and so on. But let's look at our major triad. Oop, let me change our key back, stand by. Offset. Here's our 1, 3, 5. This is your standard triad. We're going to call this a 1 because it's rooted at the 1. Anytime we have a number or we have a little description or whatever, it's always in relation to the root, which in this case is the 1 note. So if I have an augmented chord, if I say 1 aug, usually aug 5 is what is implied here. What that means is I take this 5th note and I go up a half step. This is an augmented chord, or 1 aug or 1 aug 5. So the same thing, of course, would apply if I was playing a 4 chord. The 4 chords, the standard clusters, the 4, the 6, and the 1. And if I take that 5 and I go up a half step, I get that same sound. This is the 4 aug. You remember when we talked before about the 1, and then we went to the 1, 7, and then we went to the 4, and we kind of broke down why that sounded good? A similar thing happens here. If we have a progression that goes 1, 5, and then back to the 1, it sounds like, let me come up with a voice in here. That's 1, 5, 1, right? Now if I throw in a sort of a passing chord of 5 aug, then it goes like this. And that works because our 5 chord, you can't see the other blue note is off the screen here, but this is 5, 7, 2. And then when I play this 5 aug, I'm going to take our 5 note, I'm going to move it up a half step to here, like that. And then I play my 1 chord, which has the 3 note here. So you can see we've got this this little movement that happens. Playing that aug chord causes this little half step kind of melody to occur in the progression. So that's an augmented chord. Diminished chords are interesting beasts. They're kind of the opposite. You take that 5 and you take it down a half step. No, you don't. Sorry. You take the 3 and the 5 down a half step. So this is going to move down and this is going to move down. And that's a diminished chord. So this is 1. You either see it as 1 dim or you'll see it as 1 with a little circle. And a lot of times what you will see for a diminished chord is a dim 7 chord. And just like before, we're not actually adding the 7. It's a trick. It's a trap for beginners. You're actually adding the minor. In this case, it's even weirder. You're adding the 6. Welcome to chord naming. It just gets weird. But this, when you're playing a diminished chord, what you're adding is a diminished 7th, and the 7th that you're adding was minor already. So we flattened it even again from that. So this actually means to add a 6th note. So on our 1 is here, we're going to add this 6th note as well, in addition to these moved down, these chords that we moved down here. So there's an easier way to think of diminished chords, fortunately. Hang on. Which is that they're just a stack of minor third intervals. That's a diminished 7 chord, I should say, or a diminished chord. You start here, you go up a minor third, which you'll remember is 1, 2, 3 half steps. Sorry. Then you go up 3 more, 1, 2, 3. Then you go up 3 more, 1, 2, 3. And you get that again. And if you go up 3 more, 1, 2, 3, you get back to the octave. So that's a diminished chord, or a diminished 7th chord. When we harmonized the major scale, we found that on the 7th, you might remember we're always talking about the 7 diminished chord that we never play. If we had the 1, the 2 minor, the 3 minor, the 4, the 5, the 6 minor, then we had the 7 diminished. Oh, hang on, I gotta get the notes on the screen. Here's our 7 diminished. It's not our 7 diminished. This is our 7 diminished. You can see these are all the notes. They're in the major scale. When we pick every other note as we go up, we get this minor third. We get a minor third here, and we get a minor third here. And if we wanted to add our 7th, we could add it up here. I don't have enough keys on my keyboard to do that, but you get the idea. Diminished chords, especially diminished 7 chords, are a really, you see them a lot. They're a very interesting chord. My understanding of music theory history is pretty poor, but my understanding is that Beethoven was really important for introducing the diminished chord into common usage. And one of the Bach used them all the time as well, but Beethoven had something to do with like popularization or something, I'm not sure. But they're used a lot in ragtime music. They're used a lot in singer-songwriter music. They have a lot of weird implications for music theory. They can be used as pivot chords. If you want to change key from one key to another key, you can go to a diminished chord and they kind of give you this footing. One of the interesting things about diminished chords, because they're a stack of minor thirds, your ear doesn't really get a clue as to which note is the base of the chord. Let me turn off all of our hints here, for example. Oops, yes on those. If you're just looking at the what's wrong here? Oh, there we go. So here's our diminished shape, right? If we look at a major chord, it's shaped like this. Our ear has some clues. It knows there's a wider gap here, and it knows there's a thinner gap here, and so it can kind of figure out, oh, that's the root of this chord. Likewise, if we have a minor chord, oh, I hear this wider interval on top and this one on bottom. I've got a way to orient myself. But when you play a diminished chord, especially if you extend it, you've just got this sort of evenly spaced array of notes, and so your ear can easily hear this is the root, or it can hear this is the root, and we can reflect that one up an octave. Or you can hear this is the root and reflect that up an octave, right? So diminished chords have this kind of like nebulous, they're really open. You see them a lot in minor keys. They're really commonly used in minor tunes. Yeah, I could say more about them if you want, but they're that's the shape, stacks of minor thirds. That's kind of the way to remember it. Oh, you're muted, Kim, if you're saying something.
Right. You're driving home that also that those notes that you're using aren't in the actual scale, in the major scale, right?
Yeah. Depending on the 7 diminished has 3 notes at least that are in the major scale, but the 7 diminished 7 has a note that's out of it, and a lot of times, if you root a dim 7 on any other note in the major scale, you're going to be definitely being adventurous with your note usage. Which isn't to say they're not used a lot. I mean, like that traditional jazz group I'm in uses them all the time. This like that kind of sound. This is like B flat to B flat diminished 7 to B flat. You know, it's not like it sounds like crazy jazz when you use the diminished 7 chord. You know, they're used all the time, just not so common in like Irish music or whatever. You know, they're more of like a little more contemporary, more 20th century. And Beethoven and Bach.
Thank you. Very, very good.
Good.